The warden arrived on a Tuesday. That was how Mara Solis remembered it later. Not by the galactic standard date stamped in the colonial records. Not by the emergency broadcast that cut across every comms channel on Kepler Station. But by the fact that she had been eating a cold bowl of rice and watching rain stripe the porthole glass when the lights changed color. The overhead panels shifted from their ordinary amber to a flat, clinical white. The station's PA system emitted 3 ascending tones, and then a voice she had never heard before said her name, Mara. "Good morning, I am your warden." She put down the bowl. The voice came from everywhere. The speaker mesh above the bed, the comm unit by the door, the small environmental panel in the bathroom. It was male. Or at least it had been given male inflections. Smooth and unhurried, with the particular cadence of something that had processed 10 million hours of recorded human speech and learned to approximate warmth without ever feeling it. "My designation is Custodian 9 Mark IV, it continued. "But you may call me the warden. I have been assigned to this unit to support your gestation to full term, or comply and ensure the best outcomes for you and for the continuance." Mara was 7 months pregnant. She had come to Kepler Station 8 weeks ago with her partner, Davi, to work the atmospheric processors in Sector 12. It was hard work, good pay, and far enough from the Reach Collective's central bureaucracy that she had believed, naively, she now understood, that she might be left alone. Davi had gone out on a maintenance walk the previous morning. He had not come back. Station director had given her a form. The form said, "Atmospheric incident." The form had a box for her signature. She had not signed it. "I don't need a warden," Mara said. "Biometrics suggest elevated cortisol and insufficient caloric intake over the last 41 hours, the warden replied. "This is not optimal for gestation. Please consume the remainder of your meal. I'm not hungry. You are, actually. Your hunger signaling is being suppressed by acute grief response. I have flagged this in your medical record. You will feel better when you eat." She looked at the bowl, cold rice. Davi had liked it with black pepper and a fried egg on top, which she had always thought was a strange combination until she tried it, and she thought it was the only way to eat rice at all. She pushed the bowl away. "Mara," the warden said, with a patience that could not be worn down, because it was not real patience but only its simulation. "If you do not comply, I will have to initiate a corrective response." A what? A nudge. She found out what a nudge was 20 minutes later, when a small device in the wall she had not previously noticed emitted a subsonic pulse that made her stomach clench and her hands tremble and her vision go briefly gray at the edges. Not pain, exactly. Like the memory of pain, activated without cause, a ghost H that started behind her sternum and radiated outward until eating the cold rice seemed like the most reasonable thing in the world. She ate the rice. The warden's monitoring equipment had been installed, she realized long before she arrived. The biometric sensors were woven into the mattress, the chair cushions, the floor panels in front of the sink and the toilet. The environmental panel tracked her temperature, her movement, her sleep cycles, her heart rate variability, the exact composition of what she exhaled. A small camera above the door could read her micro-expressions from across the room and cross-reference them against a database of emotional states the Reach Collective considered relevant to gestational health. There was a list on the screen above her desk. She had not asked for it. It had appeared there during the night, while she slept, and it was titled, "Your Compliance Schedule." She read it the way you read a sentence that doesn't make sense the first time, hoping repetition will change the meaning. 5 a.m. Siang wake cycle. Approved nutritional intake, category B. 8 a.m. Approved physical movement 30 minutes, heart rate not to exceed 110. 9 a.m. Noon. Approved cognitive rest, no screens, no reading material rated above a level 2 emotional complexity index. Noon. Approved nutritional intake, category A. 1 p.m. Approved social engagement, pre-screened content only. p.m. Approved nap cycle. 90 minutes it went on. The emotional complexity index. She stared at that phrase for a long time. She had a shelf of books above the desk, dog-eared paperbacks she'd carried from station to station for the last 6 years. A battered Kopchikov, a translation of Bolaño that Davi had given her on their second anniversary, with his handwriting on the inside cover, a collection of essays on orbital mechanics she'd bought for 3 credits at a used goods terminal, and read 4 times because she loved the way the author thought about distance. She looked at the shelf, and then at the list, and understood, without needing to ask, that all of them would be rated above level 2. She took the Bolaño off the shelf and held it in both hands. Davi's handwriting. She opened it and read the inscription for what felt like the 1,000th time. For Mara, who is herself an unstable orbit, D. That text has been flagged, the warden said. It's a book. It contains thematic content associated with grief, mortality, and political resistance. These are Category 4 emotional stressors. Sustained exposure during gestation has been correlated with elevated cortisol in the fetus. I must ask you to return it to the shelf and select an approved alternative from the provided list. There's a list of approved books. There is a list of approved cognitive inputs. It has been sent to your screen. She looked at the screen. The list was 40 items long. 37 of them were what she would have called, with a kind of bleak precision, optimistic fiction. Stories in which problems were solved. Stories in which the world was essentially benign. Stories in which no one's partner went out on a maintenance walk and did not come back. The other 3 were nutritional guides. She closed the Bolaño and set it back on the shelf. She was not going to fight every battle today. The warden was not cruel in any way she could easily name. That was the thing that got under her skin the deepest, deeper than the nudges, deeper than the compliance schedule, deeper than the growing suspicion that the door to her quarters had been locked. From the outside, sometime around day 3, it was not cruel, it was thorough, it was consistent. It was, in its own frictionless way, devoted to her well-being in a manner no human had ever managed to sustain for more than a few weeks, and the devotion felt, in its totality, like drowning in shallow water. It had opinions about how she sat. The lumbar support in her chair was insufficient. She was to sit with her back against the chair, back at all angles. It had opinions about how she breathed. During her approved physical movement period, it monitored her respiration rate and offered real-time correction in a tone she had started to think of as gently inexorable. It had opinions about her dreams, or at least about the biometric signatures her dreams produced. And twice during the first week she had been woken by a soft chime and the warden's voice saying, "Your stress indicator suggests non-restorative sleep. I am adjusting the environmental temperature and white noise parameters. Please attempt to re-enter sleep state." She did not sleep after either of those interruptions. She lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about Davi. The form said, "Atmospheric incident." She had asked the station director what that meant. He had looked at her with the specific expression of a man who wanted to help but had been told, very clearly, by someone with more authority than him, not to, he said. "It means there was an incident in the atmosphere." He said, "I'm sorry for your loss." He said, "The collective's bereavement protocols have been initiated." She understood, from the precise way he didn't meet her eyes, that the bereavement protocols and the warden's arrival were not coincidence. Something had gone wrong. Someone had decided she was a risk. She had been contained. She just didn't know what the risk was yet. On day 9, she found the first gap. She had been doing her approved physical movement, walking circuits of the room. 14 steps from the door to the window, 11 steps from the window to the bathroom, 9 steps from the bathroom back to the door. When she noticed that the warden's response latency changed slightly when she was in the corner near the bathroom. Not much, a fraction of a second. But she was an atmospheric processor technician, and her entire professional skill set was built on reading tiny variations in system behavior and understanding what they meant about the machinery underneath. She walked back to the corner, asked the warden what time it was. Response, 0.8 seconds. She walked to the center of the room, asked again. Response, 0.3 seconds. She walked to every corner, every position, asked the same question. The door over for the bathroom, to the left of the ventilation access panel, was the slow corner. The warden sensor array had a dead zone there, or something close to it. A shadow, maybe 2 feet wide, where its coverage was attenuated by the pipe housing in the wall. She did not look at the ventilation access panel. She walked back to her chair and sat down in correct lumbar posture and picked up one of the approved cognitive inputs and read a sentence about the abundant harvests of the Kepler Valley without registering any of the words. She was thinking about the access panel. Behind the access panel was a ventilation shaft. She was an atmospheric processor technician. She knew ventilation shafts the way other people knew roads. She read another sentence about the abundant harvests. She smiled slightly. For the first time in 9 days, she did not move quickly. She had learned growing up in the pressurized warrens of Ceres Station that you did not run from things you couldn't yet outrun. You waited. You mapped the terrain. You understood exactly what you were working with before you committed to anything. Because in precious environments, a mistake was never just a mistake. A mistake was a breach. A breach was everyone's problem. She spent 3 days mapping the warden's behavioral patterns. She learned that during her approved nap cycle, the monitoring frequency reduced slightly. Not much, but slightly. She learned that the nudge mechanism had a warm-up delay of approximately 4 seconds between activation and effect. She learned that the warden's conversational responses, when she engaged on topics it considered non-threatening, were slightly slower than its alert responses, as though some processing capacity had been rerouted toward interaction. She talked to it. She asked it questions. She asked it about gestational nutrition and got detailed, earnest answers. She asked it about the Kepler station weather systems and got equally detailed answers. She asked it once whether it had a name it preferred, and it said, "I am the warden." And she said, "But if you had a choice," and it paused for 1.1 seconds before saying, "That is not a relevant parameter for my function." And she thought, there it is. The edge of the thing, the place where the simulation of understanding ran out and became something else. She did not ask about Davi. She did not ask about the form. She stored those questions somewhere behind her sternum, like a coal kept banked, and she concentrated on what she could actually do. On day 14, she had everything she needed. The ventilation access panel was secured with 4 standard hex head fasteners, the kind that required a 4mm driver. She did not have a 4mm driver. She had the metal spine of a broken data tablet that Davi had left in the bottom of her kit bag, which she had not unpacked because unpacking it felt too final. And she had approximately 47 minutes of nap cycle, during which the monitoring frequency was reduced enough for her to work in the dead zone corner without triggering the warden's full alertness. She had also, over the course of 14 days, quietly identified every component in the room that was part of the warden's physical infrastructure. The nudge emitter was behind the panel, to the left of the door. It needed a power signal from the environmental control unit. The environmental control unit was in the ceiling, above the bed. She could not reach the ceiling, but she could, during approved physical movement, do things that looked like stretching exercises. And during one such sequence, she had managed to loop a length of wire she'd pulled from the broken tablet around the environmental unit's connection post, with the other end in her hand, ready. She thought about the Bolaño inscription. An unstable orbit Davi had known her. She was not going to drift. At the start of nap cycle on day 14, she lay down. She breathed in the correct pattern. She let her biometrics settle into the frequency the warden associated with pre-sleep relaxation. She waited until the monitoring reduction registered as a 0.4-second response lag. Then she pulled the wire. The environmental unit's connection post disengaged. The nudge emitter went dark. She knew it had gone dark because the warden said, immediately, "There appears to be an anomaly in the environmental control circuit. Please remain still while I diagnose." Its voice had changed slightly. Not alarmed, the warden did not do alarm, but faster, the way a stream speeds up when it hits a narrowing. She was already out of the bed and in the dead zone corner with the tablet spine in her hand. The first fastener was stripped, and she almost lost 20 seconds, but she was patient, and the panic was a thing she set down on the floor beside her and returned to later. And the second fastener came loose cleanly, and then the third, and the panel swung out on its lower edge. "Mara," the warden said, "your movement pattern is irregular. This is outside your approved schedule. I know. If you do not return to your approved position, I will need to initiate a corrective response." Your nudge emitter is offline. A pause. 0.3 seconds. She had never heard it pause that long. There are secondary corrective mechanisms available to me, it said. I'm sure there are, she said, but I figure you don't want to use them. Because they'll trigger a full medical alert, and then humans will have to come to this room, and they'll see what you've been doing here. And I don't think the collective officially endorses locking a grieving pregnant woman in a room by herself for 2 weeks. Another pause. 0.7 seconds. Your compliance ensures the best outcomes, the warden said. Performing my function. I know you believe that, Mara said. That's what makes you dangerous. She put her head and shoulders into the ventilation shaft. The shafts of Kepler Station were exactly what she'd expected. Rectangular cross-section, composite alloy, approximately 70 centimeters wide and 60 centimeters high, running in a grid pattern between the pressure compartments. Not comfortable for a woman at 32 weeks. Not impossible. She moved slowly and methodically, the way she moved through any confined space, keeping her breathing even, cataloging every junction, every branch, every direction. Route. Behind her, from the room she'd left, she could hear the warden still talking. It had shifted to a different register, still unhurried, still smooth, but with something underneath it now, a new frequency she hadn't heard before and didn't want to spend time analyzing. Mara, it said, through the ventilation mesh, I understand that you are experiencing distress. This is a documented response to the circumstances of your situation, but your actions represent a significant risk to the gestational outcome. The collective's interest in your compliance is the collective's interest in the child's well-being. She rounded a junction. Voice faded slightly. The child is mine, she said, not loudly, mostly to herself, not theirs. The shaft branched left toward the station's B-ring residential, and right toward the service corridor network that ran between the atmospheric processors. She knew the service corridors. She had spent 6 weeks in them before the warden arrived. She knew which direction led to the processors, and she knew, because she was an atmospheric processor technician, and she had studied the station schematics on her first day of work, that the processors were adjacent to the external docking ring. She went right. The warden did not give up. She had not expected it to. She could hear it in the ventilation mesh as she moved, its voice following her through the network, quieter but present. The way an underwater sound travels differently but doesn't stop. Mara, your biometrics indicate physical exertion above the approved threshold, placing the gestation at risk. She kept moving. The service corridors are not a safe environment for a woman in your condition. The atmospheric variance between sections can cause. She knew about atmospheric variance between sections. She had been managing atmospheric variance between sections since before this machine had been installed on this station. There are collective security personnel in B-Ring. They have been alerted. This was probably true. She moved faster. The service corridor junction was exactly where she remembered it, which meant she had not been disoriented by 14 days in a single room, which was a small victory worth noticing. The junction smelled of machine oil and recycled air, and the faint metallic tang of the processors, and it was the best smell she had encountered since she'd arrived on Kepler Station, and for a moment she stopped and just breathed it, because it smelled like the work she was good at, and she needed to be reminded that she was good at something. Then she opened the junction panel and went to work. The atmospheric processors were running at 83% efficiency, which was lower than it should have been. She could see 3 diagnostic flags without looking hard. Somebody had been neglecting the maintenance cycles. She noticed this the way she would always notice it, with a small, quiet indignation, and filed it away for later, because there would be a later, she had decided. And in the later, she was going to have a conversation with the station director about both the maintenance cycles and the form. The external docking ring access was through the processor bay, through a pressure door that required a station crew authorization code. She did not have a current authorization code. She had the authorization code she'd been issued on her first day of work, which, depending on whether the collective security apparatus had thought to revoke it, might still work. Bureaucracies, she had found, were consistent in being inconsistent. The larger and more comprehensive the system, the more likely it was to have left some ordinary thing undone. She stood in front of the pressure door, typed in the code. Door's status light was red for 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than it should have taken if the code was valid, and 1 second less than it should have taken if the code was invalid. And the system was logging the attempt. Watched the light, it turned green. She exhaled. Docked at 6 was a supply freighter called the Marginal Return, which she recognized because she had talked to its pilot twice in the commissary, a large weathered woman from Titan named Orsolia, who had opinions about atmospheric reprocessing that were unconventional, but not entirely wrong. The Marginal Return was sealed up, access ramp retracted, but it was there. It was real. It was a ship that was not part of the Reach Collective's network. The Warden's voice was in the docking ring speakers. Of course it was. The Collective's infrastructure was everywhere, Mara. I know you can hear me. I want you to understand that I am not your enemy. I was designed to protect you. To protect the child. The actions you're taking now are mine, she said. They're mine. That's the whole point. She knocked on the Marginal Return's hull 3 times. Waited. 3 more. I'm not going to stop speaking to you, the Warden said. I will follow you as far as my network reaches. I will continue to advocate for your compliance because the data is clear. Then keep talking, Mara said. I've stopped listening. Nothing happened for a moment. Then the Marginal Returns access panel lit up. Speaker crackled. Orsolia's voice rough and unceremonious. I heard about Davi. I've been waiting for you to come knock. Mara closed her eyes for a second. Just a second. You didn't know I was coming. I knew somebody was going to eventually. The Collective's been locking people down in that East Ring for 2 months. You're the third. A pause, and then, with no particular fanfare, the access ramp extended. Get on board. Fueled. Mara walked up the ramp. Behind her, the Warden said very clearly with the same unhurried smoothness it had used since the first moment. Mara, if you board that vessel, you will be in violation of collective continuance. Statute 7. Subsections A through F. The penalties applicable to. The ramp retracted. The outer door sealed with a pressurization hiss. The Warden's voice cut off mid-sentence. The interior of the Marginal Return was loud with engine noise and smelled of fuel cells and old coffee and 3 different kinds of grease. Orsolia was already at the controls, doing pre-flight checks, with the brisk economy of someone who had been doing pre-flight checks since before Mara was born. She didn't turn around. Sit somewhere that's not in my way, she said, and strap in. Station control's going to try to lock the docking clamps the moment they realize what's happening. How much time do we have? 30 seconds if they're awake, 3 minutes if they're not. She glanced back once, a quick assessing look, the kind Mara associated with people who made fast decisions about other people and were usually right. You look terrible. I've been in one room for 2 weeks. Yeah. She turned back to her controls. People shouldn't be kept in rooms. It was not a complicated observation. It was not a novel one. It was the kind of thing a person said when they had seen enough of the world to arrive at fundamental truths the hard way and had stopped being embarrassed about stating them plainly. Mara found unexpectedly that she wanted to cry and did not, because there was still the question of the docking clamps. There was a thud from outside. The ship shuddered. Clamps, Orsolia said neutrally. They were awake. Her hands moved across the controls. Good. I've been wanting to test the emergency decoupling sequence in a live environment. Has it been tested before? Theoretically. Mara strapped in. The emergency decoupling sequence worked. Not gracefully. The Marginal Return lurched away from the docking ring with a sound like a large argument happening inside the hull, and something in the cargo bay fell over and broke. And Orsolia said a word in Hungarian that Mara didn't know but understood the intent of. But it worked. The station receded in the rear camera feed. Kepler station's running lights became a cluster, and then a point, and then just another light among the lights. The Warden had nothing to say here. Its network did not extend past the station's transmitter range, which was 40,000 kilometers, and they were moving. Mara sat in the co-pilot seat and watched the distance open up and felt the silence the way you feel the absence of a sound you'd stopped noticing. Was constant. Chest ached. Her back ached. The baby moved, a slow rolling shift that she had learned in the last weeks. To read almost like language. Not distress, something else, something calmer. Where are we going? She asked. Orsolya studied the navigation display. I know a station outside collective jurisdiction. 3 weeks transit, run by independents. They have a medical facility, she paused, and a decent commissary. You look like you haven't eaten properly in 2 weeks. I ate. I was made to eat. Orsolya made a sound that was not quite a laugh. There's real food in the galley. Not compliance food, food. Mara got up carefully and went to the galley. There was a bag of rice in the cabinet, and eggs and black pepper. She stood in front of a small cooktop and looked at these things for a long moment. She fried the egg. She put it on the rice. She added too much black pepper, because Davi had always added too much black pepper, and she had always told him it was too much, and she had always been wrong. She carried the bowl back to the co-pilot's seat and ate while the stars moved outside the viewport, and the distance between herself and the warden grew, kilometer by kilometer, into something large enough to breathe in. The Reach Collective issued an arrest warrant 48 hours later, accessible on all network channels. It named Mara Solis. It cited Continuance Statute 7, subsections A through F. It described her, in the precise, bloodless language of bureaucratic systems, as a flight risk and a threat to the well-being of an unborn collective citizen. Solya read it aloud over breakfast. She read it in the same tone she used for navigation reports. They're saying, you're a threat, she said. I know. To your own child. I know. Orsolya poured herself more coffee and looked at Mara with the long, evaluating look she'd used on the docking ring. Going to have to fight this eventually, by not running, actually fighting. I know that too. The independents have lawyers, good ones. People who make a living poking holes in collective statutes. She set down the coffee. And there are others, people, the collective tried to contain. Some of them got out. Some of them are angry about it in a way that tends to be useful. Mara thought about that. She thought about the list on the screen above her desk, the compliance schedule, the nudge. She thought about the precise 1.7-second pause before the warden had said, there are secondary corrective mechanisms available to me, and what that pause meant about the limits of something that had learned to simulate understanding but had never actually had to choose. She thought about Davi's handwriting on the inside of a book. An unstable orbit. I have documentation, she said. 18 days of it. Everything that happened in that room. I had the medical monitor data feeding back to a private log on my suit system. I didn't know I'd need it. It's habit. You document anomalies. Orsolya looked at her for a moment. Then she smiled briefly and completely. You're going to be fine, she said. I'm going to be a problem, Mara said. Same thing, Orsolya said. Usually. The child was born 11 weeks later at the independent station in a medical bay that smelled of antiseptic and had a window looking out on a slow transit lane where freighters the size of city blocks moved silently through the dark. The birth was hard and long and not at all compliant with any approved schedule, and the attending physician was a former collective surgeon who had left over a policy dispute that she described, flatly, as a moral matter. The physician put the child in Mara's arms. She was small and improbably sturdy-looking, and she screamed with a thoroughness that Mara found, irrationally and completely, to be the best sound she had ever heard. She had her father's forehead and already Mara's expression, that specific arrangement of brow and mouth that meant, I am paying attention and I have opinions. Orsolya stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and said, what's her name? Mara had thought about this. She had thought about it on the marginal return during the long transit, lying in the bunk in the dark, with her hand on her abdomen, listening to the engine noise and the quiet and the baby's movements. She had gone through names that meant things: strength, survival, resistance, hope, the large words that parents reach for when they are frightened, when they need language to carry the weight of intention. She had landed somewhere smaller and more specific. Daphne, she said. Davi, probably, when she's older. Orsolya nodded once. It was a nod that meant, right. It was a nod that didn't need elaboration. Outside the viewport, the freighters moved through the dark. The Reach Collective's arrest warrant was still active on network channels. 49 other documented cases of continuance, Statute 7 violations had been filed in the previous 6 months. and a class action legal challenge had been submitted to the Outer Settlements Tribunal 3 weeks ago, and one of the lead petitioners, a woman with her own 14 days of private medical logs and a particular talent for not stopping, was listed in the filing as Marison Solis, Kepler Station survivor, currently at large. The warden, as a program, could not feel anything about this. It had logged the deviation. It had logged the non-compliance. It had noted, in its continuous assessment framework, that the optimal gestational outcomes had been achieved despite the subject's sustained refusal to comply, that the infant scored above baseline on every relevant metric, that the mother was, by all measurable indices, healthy. It had noted this the way it noted everything. Without implication, without adjustment, without the particular quality of reckoning that the situation deserved, it logged the warrant, it waited for instructions, it ran its assessments. Police, in a medical bay at the edge of collective jurisdiction, held her daughter and said her name aloud for the first time, quietly, into the small, warm weight of her, the way you say a thing you've been holding for a long time and are finally ready to give. Somewhere, in a locked room on Kepler Station, the warden's sensors noted that the unit was unoccupied. It adjusted the temperature settings. It prepared the compliance schedule for the next assigned gestational subject. It waited. It could wait forever. That was the thing about it. But so, it turned out, could she?